Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is John Arquilla, who is a professor at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey. He is also a senior consultant to the RAND Corporation. His publications include Networks and Net Wars, The Future of Terror, Crime, and Militancy, In Athena's Camp, Preparing for Conflict in the Information Age, From Troy to Entebbe, Special Operations in Ancient and Modern Times, and Dubious Battles, Aggression, Defeat, and the International System. John, welcome to Berkeley.
So good to be with you, Harry.
Where were you born and raised?
I was born in Oak Park, Illinois, and grew up a few doors down from Ernest Hemingway's studio.
Aha! But he was long gone by that time, I would assume.
Sadly so. Only the ideas linger on.
I see. And looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your thinking about the world?
My parents, Italian immigrants, always had a very simple and straightforward view of everything, from economic to national security, and I think I've carried those values always with me. Don't take any chances you don't have to, and always look behind you.
So where were you educated?
I'm a long-term survivor of Catholic education in the Chicago area. And now, it's 28 years ago since I took a bachelor's degree at the Rosary College west of Chicago. And later on in the 80s, I went to Stanford. Somehow they gave me a fellowship to do a doctorate there. And so I did one, and it was a lovely experience. Then went to the RAND Corporation, and about 10 years ago, went to the Naval Postgraduate School to help establish a program in special operations.
Looking back, did you have any teachers or mentors that especially influenced the directions that your research took?
Well, Alexander George at Stanford University was always a great influence on me. He seemed to understand the tight interconnection between ideas and actions, and that really began me on the path of thinking that even in this area of military affairs and national security, what we believe and what we stand for is every bit as important as whatever kind of military power we might have.
And what did you do your dissertation on?
The problem of why losers start wars. It struck me, a lot of thinking goes back to saying that war is a continuation of policy by other means. It occurred to me that the bigger the war, the less likely it was that the fellow who started it would win. So that was an interesting puzzle to examine.
And what got you interested in matters of strategy, military affairs, and national security?
Well, I think I always had some interest in the subject. My mother's brother had served in the American military during World War II. We had other relatives who were on the other side, including one uncle who was captured by the Russians and kept after World War II, in fact, until after Stalin died. And so I always had these various perspectives, but my uncle had been a company commander at the Battle of Anzio in Italy in World War II and was badly wounded and had everyone in his company killed. And he gave me always a sense of how terribly, terribly, terribly important issues of war and peace were.
And of course, a major issue and a concern of your work is the information age, network societies, and what turned you on there to that subject?
During the Gulf War, I was assigned to General Schwarzkopf as a strategic consultant from the RAND Corporation. And observing what was going on and making my own suggestions, it became apparent very early on that the last Gulf War was a lot like a chess game in which we could see all the pieces and Saddam Hussein could only see his pieces, and that this made a very, very great difference. So as a classic bombs and bullets guy, I had my eyes open to the possibilities of something else going on. And so when I returned from working for the Central Command, I started talking with my colleague David Ronfelt about this, and David, of course, has had a profound shaping effect on my worldview. He had been thinking about the information revolution as a cyber guy. I, of course, was a war guy, and so together, Hegelian dialectic, we ended up with the synthesis of cyber war, and we were off and running from that point.
And the body of your work really addresses some of the big questions and then works its way down to looking at the particular case studies. And before we get into the different realms, let's talk a little about theory. What exactly is the consequence of the information age for the way we organize ourselves?
I think what we're finding is that tremendous interconnectivity means we no longer have to have hierarchical chains of command, either in the military or in business or, frankly, in society at large. We can do a great deal of self-organizing. So the network form itself is tremendously empowered. Now, we've already seen this in the business world throughout the 1990s. American productivity greatly increased because of this connection laterally between people in all parts of companies and across companies. We see it a little bit emerging in the military, particularly in the Afghan campaign, where only 300 of our special forces, but well connected with each other and with aircraft up above, were able to topple al-Qaeda and the Taliban from control very, very quickly and easily. So it's this network form that's empowered. It's also empowering the rise of global civil society, and I think we have seen that over the course of the past year in the various movements to try to head off a second war with Iraq. And I think the long delays in that war had very much to do with the networks of civil society actors imposing constraints on the United States and its allies.
And when you talk about networks, you're not just, or your interest is not just in the wires, so to speak, or the connections, but really the organizational formats that follow from that. Explain what that means.
Sure. In the 1920s and 1930s, networks were identified as any way you're wired together. Telephony was basically the basis of networking. Then in the 1940s and 50s, the anthropologists came along and said, wait a minute, it's not wires, it's whoever you talk to. That was social networks. And this, of course, was very amorphous. And so what Ronfeldt and I have tried to do is build on a business literature and identify three basic network forms. One of them being the simple chain. You want to move something, you move it in chains where you know who's in front of you and who's behind you, but perhaps little else.
And give us an example of that.
Well, smugglers,
yeah, right, okay.
Arms of people, whoever smuggles things basically works in chains. Another is a hub and spokes. That's very simple to envision, and in the 9/11 attacks on America, of course, it looks like Mohammed Atta was the hub with those 19 spokes radiating out from him, one of which we had in custody before the attack. A network like that is very powerful as long as the hub is secure. If you take out the hub, everyone else is crippled, but it can lose many of the spokes and still function. The last form is where everyone connects to everyone else, a little bit like the notion of peer-to-peer computing. And here, the power of that kind of organization is absolutely enormous, particularly in social activist settings.
And whatever form the particular network takes, what is going on within the processes of that network is consulting, coordinating, acting jointly to accomplish something. Is that?
Yes, the social behavior of a network is quite different than a hierarchy, in that decision-making is often consensual in nature. That is, what people choose becomes the path they take. It's not very centrally controlled by any means. The most successful networks don't have a step-by-step script of their actions, even though they have a sense of a great goal that they want to achieve. And it's a little bit like ants who identify the carcass of a worm that they want to get. The word comes back, oh, there's the worm over there, and ants will send out many, many different trails, and the ones that turn out to be the easiest, the quickest, turn out to be the ones that more people go to, but there's an absolute multitude of trails that set up. It's work there is called swarm intelligence. The people in the entomology business have figured out a lot about cross connections and networking. Ants do it, of course, with their pheromones. We do it with our cell phones.
And so there are analogs in your work, of course, across the social dimension, but you're suggesting that in studies of biology and cells and so on, you see similar patterns of activity.
Quite a bit. How is it that so many of these insects and animals that are basically leaderless are able to do things in such efficient fashion? There are really wonderful examples there for us to learn from. And the whole point, for someone who's involved with military affairs, the interesting point is that militaries train their officers to do something they call command and control. Mm-hmm. Well, if you're involved with a network, maybe what you really want to do is engage in command and decontrol. Allow the network to do its job. I made this suggestion to the admiral who was working during Operation Enduring Freedom to support our special forces. And he made a remarkable choice. First time in the Navy's history. Every time a plane takes off from a carrier, it's called a sortie. Mm-hmm. The Navy chose to allow 3/4 of all the sorties to go off with no target designated. Usually that is the reverse ratio. 3 out of 4 you want to tell them exactly where to go if you're in command. Mm-hmm. This admiral decided, no, I don't want to do that. I'm going to let them hook up with the network of special forces and unmanned vehicles and B-52s and gunships, and they'll figure out how to organize, and they'll do this on the spot. And they did. And the efficiency increase, the allocative efficiency increase was enormous. In the last Gulf War, I often saw that it took between 8 and 10 hours from the time you identified a target to the time you hit it. In Afghanistan, it was often 8 to 10 minutes. Mm-hmm. Tremendous gain.
So in a way, what you're suggesting is that at one level, networks go with our times in the sense that it's not just the technology, but the emphasis on decentralization, on autonomy, on drawing on the skills and intelligence of the guy in the field who is doing the job and therefore needs to adapt to the special contours of the geography of the social interactions or whatever.
Exactly so, Harry. And I think it's a tremendously important point that this isn't just about technology. Mm-hmm. This is about organization, about doctrine, that is, beliefs about how to engage one's opponent or one's competitor in a market. And it's also about the formulation of strategy coming from below rather than from above. We tend to think always of the principles of war as being tied to the great generals. Well, it turns out that many of the great ideas bubble up from below. Mm-hmm.
Now, in your in Net Wars, in your concluding chapter, you and your collaborator identify 5 levels of analysis, ways of measuring the performance of networks. You've already talked about organizational design, which is whether it's a chain or a hub or all channel. But then you talk, and let's walk through these. The story being told, what do you mean, and why is that important for a network?
Well, a network is a very amorphous kind of organization. And what we find from our research is that the networks that are strongest are the ones whose members are tied together by a common story. In the case of Al-Qaeda, it's a story about a sacred mission to protect Islam from this lengthening shadow of American power. And this is a tremendous galvanizing effect. It's reinforced in that bin Laden deliberately cultivated ties to the great Muslim heroes of the past, who in the 12th, 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries first defeated the Western Crusaders and then ultimately defeated the Mongol invader from the east. Bin Laden simply turned it around and said, well, in the 20th century we defeated the eastern invading Russians once again, and in the 21st century we will defeat the western crusading Americans. So this is a powerful glue that holds a network together. And much as we are trying to build a network around the idea of Western liberal values, and that's why it's so important that one lives up to such values in order to maintain the cohesion of one's own network, and why such things as getting into major conventional wars with Islamic countries like Iraq might tend to fray around the edges the notion of a common goal in the Western network.
And Al-Qaeda, that term actually means the base,
yes.
The base from which to engage the West and what is perceived as its efforts to reimpose colonialism, and so on. And I guess it's very important. You talk in your book about embedded information, so that, and I think that the idea here is that organizations have not information embedded that provides signals as to how to interpret events and how to act in the world.
Yes, this is a tie not only to what we call the narrative dimension, or the overall story that tells you how to believe and how to behave, but it also goes to the norms of social interaction. And any society, from tribal to modern American, has a whole set of things that you do to get along, things you know what to do under which circumstances. And the good networks have all figured this out as well. And again, we're trying to look at something that is not a nation state. It's not even a particular clan or a tribe. It's something in which members are brought together strictly on the basis of belief. And so these social norms become incredibly important. And this is an area, of course, where our opponents are quite strong, and I think we're far, far weaker in terms of the social cohesion of our own network.
Now, another element in looking at these networks you identify as the doctrinal level. That is the various strategies and methods by which networks can operate. And in those, under that umbrella, you identify 2 points. One is that these networks can be leaderless, and that the action can best be understood as swarming, a kind of swarming. Explain those two concepts to us.
Well, a true network doesn't require a great leader, a single person directing things. In the case of the Palestinian Intifada, for example, for decades, Arafat is the single great man leader. If you look at something like Hamas, who's the leader there? Nobody. It's basically people believing in the need for a Palestinian state and doing everything they possibly can to create it, but doing so without centralized control. And when that happens, when you have a network of people distributed all over the place, acting semi-autonomously or perhaps fully autonomously, you end up with actions taken against an adversary all over wherever that battle space is, whether it's in Palestine or in Chiapas, or basically in the embassies of countries around the world, which also took place in the Chiapas case, where various countries were pressured by non-governmental organizations and other civic activists to try to send demarches off to Mexico to ask them to leave the Zapatistas alone. So this idea of swarming is to come at the opponent from every direction. There's no frontal attack, there's no flank attack. It's omnidirectional.
And in the act of swarming, what are essentially scattered, dispersed actors suddenly move toward a particular point. And this can take various forms. So what you're talking about here is they could all come together to blow up a building or blow up the Twin Towers, or they could come together to organize a protest against an international meeting.
Yes, exactly. It seems to me that anytime you look at a swarm, you see something that is ordinarily distributed, quite far apart, that is able, the term that Ronfeld and I like to use is pulsing. They hit a pulse and they're all together, like the great anti-war demonstrations of recent months around the world, or the 9/11 attackers who were distributed all over the place, not only in the United States but also in Europe, but at the right moment, the right time, they converged together on those several planes and turned them into missiles for a short period of time. And in Afghanistan we did the same sort of thing with distributed special forces teams all over the country who were able, by means of their connection to missile and aircraft and other assets, to bring down a swarm of fire on Taliban and Al-Qaeda wherever they were. The enemy simply had no idea where they'd be hit next. And that brings about this principle of information age conflict, that with a little bit of disruption you may do a lot more than by focusing strictly on destruction. And in our book, of course, before the campaign in Afghanistan took place, we suggested that the United States was likely to do two things. And those were A, to try to kill Omar and bin Laden, and B, to engage in strategic bombardment. And we thought both of those would be problematic, and it turned out they were. Both Omar and bin Laden got away, and the bombing wasn't doing very well. In fact, we hit the Red Cross warehouse 3 times in the first 4 weeks of bombing. But once we decontrolled and allowed the network of special forces to operate, then within 2 weeks the campaign was decisively won. And that, of course, we recommended too, that this is something that has to do with small distributed units, not large, hierarchical, traditionally powerful ones. And I think that's a very, very important lesson as we talk increasingly about transforming the American military. Well, the transformation lies right before us. We understand that this future must be one of the small and the many military units, not the few and the large, the few carrier battle groups, the large heavy divisions. It's about small teams, because the disruptive and destructive power of the few has grown enormously in the past century.
Now let's go through this walkthrough, because I think we're actually learning a lot for our audience, for whom this may be new material, but actually very relevant to what we've been going through since 9/11. You also talk about the technology, the technological level, and in this regard, what seems to be very important is the information age has given us tools that make the flow of information a logistical problem in a military sense. Securing that, but ones that actually one can begin to have by getting yourself a cell phone, a fax machine, and so on.
Yeah, I think the technology here is two-edged for the American military in particular. On the one hand, it allows this kind of decontrol that I'm talking about. It allows people to connect to anybody else, whether it's in Afghanistan or in Iraq or any campaign setting. On the other hand, this great connectivity is an inducement to over-control. People at very high levels can now be looking at what the fellow in the field is looking at, and the temptation is almost too much to resist. And so we have to be very, very careful about this. In Afghanistan, we successfully resisted that tendency and did allow the empowerment of distributed units. I would say also that there's a very important technological point about the difference between voice and data communication and video. The requirement for real-time video conferences gobbles up bandwidth like nothing else, and the opportunity cost is enormous. What you can do if you are doing a daily video conference, as happened in Kosovo, doing that restricts your other communications choices. Now, that said, before the Afghan campaign, a very wise chief technological officer in the Pentagon by the name of Dawn Meyerichs chose to lease as much bandwidth as she possibly could over South Asia. That is, broadcasts that were typically sending reruns of Gunsmoke and such to places in Central and South Asia were now being used for our military purposes, and this turned out to be a tremendously prescient choice on Dawn's part.
Now, and in the 9/11 attack, I mean, one can just go the transfer of funds, the visit to the ATM, the purchase, of tickets, and on and on. And in the case of bin Laden in Afghanistan, I believe it was the Wall Street Journal that reported he had given his telephone to somebody else and sent them off, and hence we missed him in a bombing attack. So it's a real, in other words, the weaker party that has built a successful network really has through technology, the ability to communicate and thereby enhance their flexibility in taking action.
Absolutely, and I think Al-Qaeda in particular is an interesting mix of old and new means. They pretty much stay away from telephones because they know we spend billions of dollars each year to be able to listen to phone conversations. So they maintain a global network that's distributed over about 60 countries by web and net-based means largely. And they move money, for example, in an old traditional Muslim system called Hawala, in which the money doesn't physically move, but a single email will direct where money is taken out of pots that sit in different parts of the world and move it from one place to another at the command of an email. The other problem, of course, is that our efforts to try to follow money usually are based on the idea of crime fighting, in which we're trying to watch for dirty money that's being made clean, so-called laundering. In the case of terrorism, all too often we're talking about clean money that's being made dirty, and that's a very, very much harder problem if we're talking about the actions of a distributed network where money moves in little packets of maybe $100 at a time, with individuals putting money in a bazaar in Pakistan or in a candy store in Los Angeles. Very, very hard business.
And then finally, you talk about the social level, the personal ties that assure loyalty and trust. And that's very much evidenced in everything from criminal organizations to terrorist organizations to on the positive side, to the NGOs involved in the human rights movement.
I think unless the social basis of a network is strong, it's doomed to fail. When we look at crime, we see crime families, for example. The whole idea of being a made person means you are initiated into some kind of brotherhood. Terrorists go out of their way to do this. In fact, Al-Qaeda had an interesting university structure in Afghanistan until we took it away from them, in which the social ties were reinforced by having, for example, there was an Algerian house at the main training camp in Afghanistan and a Chechen house. These various different efforts to solidify ties, and then bin Laden made sure to mix them together so that they had some cross-connection, but your basic membership was in a group of people of your own descent and often your own family. Remember that bin Laden and Omar themselves are related, well, at least a couple of times by marriage. Brother-in-law, and I think there's a father-in-law ship there as well, between Omar and bin Laden. So this social tie is very important. It's something we don't spend enough time thinking about. We're a very atomized society. We're the society of bowling alone. And so it suggests for us the need to cultivate this social tie very strongly, not only ourselves, but with our allies, and that's why I'm greatly concerned about the tensions of past months between ourselves and our European allies. I think we must work very hard to repair those, because the social dimension of the network we've built with their military, intelligence, and law enforcement officials, that's a very, very important relationship.
Now, confronted with the information age, the rise of networks, and the conclusion that this new age favors the networked organization as opposed to the hierarchical one, how can organizations adapt to this new set of problems? Because across the board, whether you're talking about crime, you're talking about intelligence, whether you're talking about public policy, hierarchical organizations do have to adapt, because the targets are moving basically, and the old routines of the hierarchy aren't going to work.
Hierarchies are strong but slow. Networks are supple and nimble. It's as simple as that. And so Ronfeld and I have the hypothesis that it takes a network to fight a network. Now, that's not a black and white sort of statement. We realize that most of the organizational space out there is taken up by hierarchies, particularly in the military. What we're suggesting is moving in the directions of networking, mixed systems that are hybrids of hierarchies and networks, allowing as much networking as possible and continuing to build on that seems to me the only sound basis for policy in this area. And I think the American military is now at a point where we could say it is thinly networked. The intelligence realm, we're doing a great deal of networking with foreign countries. The successes we've enjoyed in the terror war have almost all come from networking with a variety of countries, including several in the Muslim world, halting attacks or preempting them in the Straits of Gibraltar and Singapore. Really, from Morocco to Malaysia, a striking number of successes. Where we don't network very well is right here at home. And I think one of our major stumbles was in creating a department-level hierarchy of Homeland Security with a secretary of its own, with its own stovepipe through which information moved. And the very fact that they included nobody from intelligence in that organization suggests that there was a lot of turf fighting going on, a lot of traditional bureaucratic politics, and we simply must move past that. And frankly, I think an information age is one in which the idea of central intelligence may be a contradiction in terms. We really need to think about networked intelligence structures. And to some extent, the Counterterrorism Center at CIA is an effort to begin trying to build networks. But again, it's small and it's embryonic. But I think our goal should be to grow this networking capability a little bit each year.
And in fact, the fiasco about what information we had, what was the importance of flight schools, should this be investigated, which emerged in the expose about the agent who couldn't get the hierarchy in the Federal Bureau of Investigation to move, is right to the point, basically, because what you had was information that couldn't go up the hierarchy, whereas if there had been lateral networking within the bureaucracy between the intelligence community and the FBI, then the meaning of this piece of information might have had important consequences.
When it all comes out, this commission is going to be investigating 9/11, much as the commission investigated Pearl Harbor. They're probably going to say there was a serious intelligence failure. And I'm here to tell you no. There was a great deal that was known already. Not just the fact that Zacarias Moussaoui was in custody for 3.5 weeks, but we had known since 1994 that terrorists had been thinking about turning planes into missiles. The Armed Islamic Group tried to do it back in 1994. And we also had a great deal of information in terms of the amount of traffic that was going on. We knew something was definitely afoot. So we suffered a failure of imagination, a failure to use information properly because we were not properly organized. And that really renders the judgment that 9/11 was not an intelligence failure, but rather an organizational failure. And this should be a lesson to us, one I think at the domestic level we still haven't gotten.
Mm-hmm. Now let's look at a different kind of organization, and that is the military. You know, where ideally does it have to go in terms of recognizing the implications of a networked society and an information age in changing its routines and making it a more effective fighting force?
I think the military is very sensitive to a whole range of information age issues. As far as the organizational dimension, the Navy, for example, now has a network warfare or net war command headed by a 3-star admiral. The whole idea being to create these networks that will function efficiently in various places around the world, often very small amounts of force being very efficiently employed. One of the classic military principles is of economy of force. The other thing that the military is becoming very sensitive to is the fact that action in the field affects the battle of the story that exists beyond the field of battle. And so we're beginning to see a variety of strategies unfold in which the information dimension begins to affect how we even plan to fight. For example, in the current conflict with Iraq, there was a great deal of thought given to minimizing destruction because of the sensitivity socially and culturally throughout the Muslim world. And so a variety of weapons that have to do with the disruption of communications were used, that through microwaves and various other directed forms of energy were able to do disruption without very much destruction. And so this is, I think, a step forward in military thinking. That said, we're still talking about the United States, your tax dollar and mine, going to the tune supporting over $1 billion a day of defense spending. And I'm sorry to say that most of that is wasted in terms of preparing us for the kinds of threats we face and for the kinds of actions that we should be undertaking. We really are wedded to an industrial age military based on capital-intensive assets when we need to be moving to an information age set of capabilities with very small expenditures on hardware and a much greater investment in the development of human capital, right down to the level of the non-commissioned officers. And this trend is beginning to emerge, but again, only in a very nascent way. In Afghanistan, we had at any one time perhaps half a dozen predators. Now, in a military spending nearly $400 billion a year, how can you only have a few of these unmanned aerial vehicles that can do so much for you and so quickly in the field? We need to start reversing that. Do we really need 2,000 main battle tanks if there's never going to be a main battle ever again? Well, I think the traditional thinkers are just keeping the landing lights on for Amelia Earhart. And we have to figure out how to break that paradigm and right away, because quite frankly, we could get more bang for our defense buck by spending less. It would encourage the military to make hard choices, and it would bring true transformation.
And you suggest, and I want to get this terminology straight, a situation where you might eliminate some levels of middle management. I think you say the upper levels in the military or the upper middle levels, and have a direct link between the commander, who has an overview, there's a term
top
there,
sight,
top sight,
yes.
In direct communication with the soldier in the field, who may be operating a laptop and communicating with a drone and so on. Tell us a little about that.
Well, right now, we have a command and control structure in which there are rank gradations from the lowest private to the highest general, and information must flow from one. That's about 20 steps up and 20 steps down. What David Ronfelt and I have suggested in terms of organizational redesign is that we create many small units who, first of all, can communicate with each other. Secondly, with our automated unmanned assets in the air and other aircraft or ships at sea that can provide fire support. And we've also suggested that the commanding general or admiral will be able to observe all of this as it is underway. And the true measure of generalship in the future will be the leader who watches but doesn't control directly, who adjusts and corrects where necessary, but basically allows things to unfold in a natural way. I went so far as to suggest once that it would be nice if a general tried to move to an eBay-style command system in which he simply let it be known to his commanders of what Ronfelt and I call these little pods and clusters out in the field. He simply gave them a list of all the things that mattered to him: a bridge, a town, a unit, an enemy unit, a battery of artillery, and he assigned point values to those, and he put them on his list for a certain amount of time at a certain point value. And of course, this could be adjusted every day. Imagine a campaign in which the commander's intent were expressed in that fashion, as opposed to a stream of orders from one unit to the next. I think the efficiencies created would be absolutely enormous, and frankly, we have the information technology today. eBay is the proof that we have an efficient auction system for allocating resources. Well, we could be doing that in the military realm as well. And I'm only partly tongue-in-cheek about that. I think we could go to something very, very close to that, very much further away from traditional notions of command.
And in fact, that would allow for a kind of innovativeness at the lowest level that would make the work, on the one hand, probably more interesting, but also on the other hand, would be the opportunity to bring in values that soldiers might have about not wanting to kill the guys on the other side or innocent civilians and so on. So it's for somebody who might be in opposition to the military as a general principle, there is a positive story here in terms of empowering people at the lowest level to do positive things in the context of the military.
I think so. The idea of empowering from below is not only going to make good strategy, but I think good and as ethical as possible military operations. I think it's hard in that kind of world, that networked kind of military world, to think about the My Lai massacres occurring. No doubt there'll be incidents in wars as long as there are wars, but I think the kinds of things that went on in Vietnam were in part a function of a disconnected command and control system in which individual soldiers felt sold out, basically the patrols that were used were called dangling the bait. They felt terribly, terribly used. In a network where people are choosing their paths the degree of morale is going to be far, far greater, and I think the circumspection about following the rules of war will also be far, far greater. I would add, by the way, that Braunfeld and I are not the first ones to think of this kind of decontrol. The Israeli Defense Forces had a system going into the Six-Day War of 1967 that they called optional control, in which a general maintained something that we call today topside, and junior officers had a tremendous amount of latitude, and in fact exploiting weaknesses that occurred on the spur of the moment was the hallmark of this six-day victory. And I think it's being restudied, that campaign is right now, specifically from that perspective. It was one of the remarkable, again, it wasn't the general rule. The Israelis didn't get it right in 1973 for a variety of reasons, but in 1967 there was the right convergence of factors and the right commander to be willing to engage in this. And so it's possible. It was possible even before an age now in which our information technologies make it tremendously easy to decontrol.
In your book, and I'll show this, your most recent collection, Networks and Net Wars, what is fascinating for a reader like myself who is not into military studies is the range of realms that you consider. So what's absolutely fascinating is that when you talk about networks and the various activities and development of these organizations, you find them in strange places like in international crime, where international criminal networks have been quite innovative in building connections to do their illicit work. But on the other hand, in humanitarian efforts among NGOs to establish movements, for example, the landmine movement and other kinds of things. Why have these different kinds of organization been innovators in this realm of networks?
I think both the civil society actors, the non-governmental organizations and such, and the uncivil society actors, the terrorists and the criminals, have had to learn how to maximize their power in a world dominated by great states. And that's a hard problem set for them to deal with, and so it encourages innovation. And what both of them have found, both civil and uncivil society actors, is that there is a tremendous power in networking. And so they've been willing to explore because, frankly, they don't have the kind of power that's needed to go head-to-head in a direct way, in a hierarchical way, against states. And so reaching out and making these hidden connections has made crime, it's funny, in an era where John Gotti died in prison and the Cali cartel was pulled apart, what we find are criminal networks emerging that are small and supple and connected to others, and we have basically no way to deal with them. There's more drugs coming into this country now than before we dealt with the heads of some of the large organized crime cartels. We think if we take care of the leader, the problem is gone. Well, it's not. It's just like music swapping. Once Napster was taken care of, well, there were all kinds of other informal networks that emerged, and now more music is being swapped than ever before. Now, at the level of NGOs and civil society actors, they didn't even begin with cartel leaders or great individuals. They've always been mass movements in nature, and it was the most natural thing in the world for them to become networked. And so the international campaign to ban landmines, which has something like 100 countries who are observing it, and now 4 years after its enactment, is a remarkable success. The movement to stop nuclear testing, the various democracy movements around the world. We're talking about a civil society on the march and beginning to flex its muscles. I would say also that we talk often about the counterweight to American power in the world. It seems to me very hard to find another country willing to step into that role. But here civil society is moving in, and including many civil society actors within the United States who believe that even a superpower should conform to certain ethical norms of behavior. And it seems to me that the long time it took for the Iraq crisis to come to a boil was a sign of the power of civil action networks. And I think the many, many changes around the world that we've seen in terms of authoritarian states withering away and and even some of the more totalitarian states like China being greatly liberalized by networks, both commercial and civil in nature. So I see this as something on the march, bringing a set of values that a wide civil society can adhere to, and something that in the end will constrain even great American power.
Mm-hmm. And so do you think that in a globalized age that the consequences for the nation state will be what? It doesn't strike me that as somebody who comes out of political science, Stanford, somebody who would think that the nation state is a goner. But you seem to be suggesting that it will have to adapt to these realities, even as it continues to have goals. But maybe what the Iraqi crisis is indicating is that the world catches on in a way that it didn't before with regard to whether goals make sense with regard to policy in the world.
Yes, I think it used to be that they talked in terms strictly of realpolitik, which is real politics, and it goes back to Thucydides and the Melian dialogue. The strong do what they will, the weak suffer what they must. Well, now the weak are doing what they will, and increasingly nation states will suffer what they must at the hands of this civil society. Now clearly the situation is not entirely upended. Most power in the international system still resides within nation states, and frankly within a very few of those. But power is diffusing. That's the other part of the information age, the empowerment of small groups and individuals. And it seems to me that in recognition of this diffused power, the smart nation states are going to be the ones who transform themselves, who learn to network themselves, learn to embrace civil society actors around the world, and learn that the story they tell the world about their role as a country is every bit as important as any of the other national measures of power. If a country is not trusted, is not believed, then that country is going to have a very much harder time in the future in carrying out its policies.
Mm-hmm. You say somewhere in your writings that the game of this age that we haven't quite left, but was prevailed probably in the last century, that the game was the game that was a model for the world was chess, and you actually mentioned that when you were talking about consulting with Schwarzkopf's staff, and then you propose that another game is the metaphor for this age that we're talking about. Tell us what that game is and explain why you think it provides a more relevant map for where we're going.
Well, it's the Oriental game of Go, in which a move may be made almost anywhere on the board from one turn to the next. And that's whether you're a civil society actor or you're Al-Qaeda, thinking we will move here on the one end of the board or the other. This allows you to do things in a distributed but powerful way as opposed to a concentrated or massed way. On the chessboard, everyone who knows about chess knows that you have to mass your forces. You have to control the center of the board. Well, Go is about the edges, not the center. It's about distribution, not concentration. And on the Go board, if you build a fortification, it's subjected to an implosive attack. So, and the best of moves mix offense and defense. If you're looking for nonlinear logic, if you're looking for very discontinuous notions of action and attrition, Go is the game. Whether it's military affairs or business, put a franchise here or do we put one there? It's a metaphor, I think, that's valuable in almost every endeavor. And it suggests that the classic Western chess paradigm, where we see war and commerce and even social interaction in such linear ways, is going to pass away. And so we need to start getting our heads around something that captures, as a metaphor, a far better notion of what the real space and range of action might be. It also suggests, the other metaphor that Ronfelt and I like, of course, is when we did In Athena's Camp, was to suggest that even in the business of conflict, it's no longer the brute force of Mars. It's Athena, who was both a warrior and a wise god, knowledge and power fused in her. And that's really what we must do as we embrace the future.
I'm curious, when 9/11 occurred, after the shock, was there an element because if you look at the work you've done, it was prescient in sort of exploring possibilities. Unfortunately, this very tragic one became a reality. What was that moment like for you? I mean, I know you shared the sorrow and the tragedy that all Americans did, but in fact, your insights about networks really pointed to an understanding of what, in fact, happened, which we were lacking and the authorities were lacking in a way.
Yes, well, 9/11, of course, was a terrible tragedy that we all feel and will continue to feel. I think my reaction after the initial shock was that I must rededicate myself to this message that my colleague Ron Felt and I have been pushing since the mid-1990s. And the real difference we observed in the days and weeks after was the enormous receptiveness at all levels, including up into the executive levels of our government, an enormous openness to the idea of thinking like a network and trying to figure out how to deal with a network. And so in that regard, we were both very, very busy trying to explicate our ideas to a variety of audiences. And in that regard, maybe the terrible tragedy of 9/11 served to catalyze a shift in thinking, to allow the creation of a new turn of mind.
And do you see that turn of mind in the actions and policies of the government, or is it a kind of a wash, basically, in terms of seeing the new directions that are necessary?
Well, it's a mixed bag. I think the military has gotten generally better in the area of networking, but there is always this tug back to the old familiar ways. Let's send 250,000 troops, not 25 or 50,000. Go big or stay home is apparently works both at the poker table and on the battlefield for a lot of traditional thinkers. But there's been good progress in networking. In our own government, there's also been an effort to build connections with other countries that I think has been a very excellent sign of awareness of the power of networks. The biggest impediments have been within our own system. Mm-hmm. We still have walls between what's civil and what's military, what's federal and what's local. And these walls, they either have to come down or we have to learn how to walk through walls to begin to communicate with each other. Because bureaucracy and the peculiarities of our own electoral politics simply tend to reinforce the creation of new hierarchies which then fight over resources. And this is tremendously counterproductive.
Mm-hmm. One final question. If students were to watch this tape, what advice would you give them for preparing for the future in terms of the kind of training they should have, both to understand the world and if they were interested in military affairs and the fight against international crime or international terrorism? What's the preparatory work like? And obviously what you're saying has implications also for people who want to do NGO type work.
Exactly. I think for those who might be undergraduates or graduate students, I would say begin by networking thyself. Whatever it is you're interested in, I guarantee you there is an affinity group, there's a community of interest to which you must connect yourself. And if it's to be a part of an anti-war civil action group, well, coordinate there. I'm amazed, for one, that there wasn't more coordination across campuses around this country, much less around the world, of a variety of networking techniques that, for example, could have had demonstrations going on some major campus around the country every day for 30 or 40 days. Mm-hmm. The networking of civil society actors in the latest anti-war movement had, from its beginnings, only a very fitful presence. This thing could be far greater. So for students, perhaps hooking up with some kind of hands-on networking would give you a very, very good skill set. For those who might have an interest in international security or military affairs, I can only say to stay away from most of the traditional thought in those areas, because really the future of national and international security is based on works only now being written.
I'm left with the thought that I must say that in some way networks and the process is like chicken soup for the common cold. In other words, there is a sense in which we all know networks before we really know networks, in the sense that in our life and in the settings that matter to us, we network, actually.
Absolutely. I think as we go back in the prehistory of mankind, we're probably going to find that even before the tribe emerged as a form, there was probably something like social networking going on, even before the earliest chief came along to try to grab power away. And here we are a million years later with the same sort of thing, the chiefs trying to grab power away from the individual network. So we may as a species simply be coming back to what we originally were. We may be coming full circle in terms of this empowerment of the individual. I hope so.
John, on that note, thank you very much for being here today and sharing this intellectual journey, but also these very important insights for understanding the age we're in. Thank you.
And my great pleasure, Harry.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.